Now, farmers were certainly different from the industrial worker in that farming was a little more independent, a little less restricted to a workday clock. And so farmers needed to find their own ways to kind of respond to the issues that they were facing. In the last 4 decades of the 19th century, so the last 40 years of the 1800s, Americans really overproduced wheat and cotton. They just turned out too much. When you have too much of something, then you have a decline in the demand, which means you have a decline in the price. Farmers increased production so that they could sell enough crops to cover the money that they had borrowed for supplies. This, of course, resulted in an oversupply and caused the prices to drop even further, making it very hard for farmers, of course, to repay their loans because they can't sell the crops. Eventually, this put many of the properties of the farmers into foreclosure. Farmers couldn't easily fall back on other types of work like urban industrial workers might, for a variety of reasons, the main one, of course, being geography. There weren't a lot of mills in the middle of farmlands. Farms are very isolated, they're very spread out across a lot of rural terrain. And at the same time, it's a very solitary life, so there's not a lot of social and cultural interaction. Farmers were very difficult to organize, but they knew that they needed better social and cultural interaction, and this led Oliver H. Kelly in 1867 to establish the Patrons of Husbandry, or the Grangers, which offered educational and social activities, fairs, and picnics to the rural farm dwellers. The Grangers became a vastly popular organization in the 1870s, particularly in the South and in the Midwest. And between 1872 and 1874, roughly 14,000 Grange chapters were established. Grangers functioned more than just a social or cultural organization. They formed cooperatives to sell goods at higher prices. They help the farmers to pool their resources to buy goods at a wholesale rate and provided a gateway through which farm workers could enter politics by endorsing candidates that supported their causes. The Grangers embraced regulatory measures for grain and storage prices as well as a specific shipping rate. Grangers endorsed regulations that were met with both government support and government hindrances. In 1877, in Munn v. Illinois, it was upheld that regulation of private property, if it benefited the public. And then in Wabash v. Illinois in 1886, the court struck down laws for standing in the way of interstate commerce. Now, this meant that even if farmers were able to organize, if there was a negative or a perceived negative to the public, that their rights could be ignored by the federal government. Proponents of the regulation celebrated the 1887 when the Interstate Commerce Commission was established. Now, the Interstate Commerce Commission was established specifically to regulate railroads, but it frequently operated at the behest of the business owners of those railroads, who found that national regulatory groups were easier to deal with than separate state organizations. So now, with this Interstate Commerce Commission, which is supposed to regulate the railroad realizes that it's much easier to work with this interstate or this federal entity than it is to argue with different states who have different rules and different demands. Now, the Grangers were not the only group that drew farmers into politics. In the Great Plains and the South areas, farmers organized what was called the Farmers Alliances. Milton George formed the Northwestern Farmers Alliance, and Dr. Charles W. Mancune formed the Southern Farmers Alliance in the 1880s. There was also a colored Farmers Alliance formed as a counterpart to the Southern Farmers Alliance, which only allowed white farmers to join the organization. Now, the various farmers alliances do attempt to help farmers to deal with issues of debt and to ensure that they're able to store, ship, and sell their products at fair rates. The Southern Farmers Alliance advocated for a sub-treasury system to deal with farmers who were increasing in the amount of debt that they had due to the systems that were in place. The system would allow farmers to store any non-perishable goods in federal offices, and as a result of this, the federal loans for 80% of the current market value for their produce. So the idea was that the federal government would guarantee a certain value, 80%, to the farmer. In 1889, the Southern and Northwestern Farmers Alliances merged together and invited the Knights of Labor to join them. This opened the doors for colored farmers as well and created the National Farmers Alliance and Industrial Union, which had its first convention in Florida. Now, what happens here is farmers recognize that they are not just competing for a living and a livable wage with the government and the business owners, but they also recognize that there are thousands of other workers who are facing the same challenges. And so the workers of America, whether they are farm workers or mill workers, industry workers, really attempt to come together and find a way to combat what they believe to be an oppressive system. Now, the Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890 allows the government to purchase silver again, but limits the way that they can do that. And still, and it didn't promise that there would be any silver coinage. Now, the alliance could have promoted paper money or what was called greenbacks, meaning, green dollars. But that may have had more appeal, but the farmers wanted to attract the Western silver miners to join them as well. Again, the hope all along was truly that those who do the work that keeps America moving and growing, that they would be able to come together collectively and organize to advocate for better wages, to advocate for better working conditions, to advocate for some type of insurance or compensation if they are hurt doing whatever job they do. The alliance did not find a lot of support among the Democratic and Republican parties, and it really hoped that they could make a new party, a new way to combat these parties that they believed were really working for the companies, for the business owners. And so the farmers established what is called the Populist Party. Now, the Populist Party was formerly known as the People's Party of America and was established in 1892. It took on the alliance's key issues as part of its platform, and those issues were a graduated income tax, the 8-hour workday, a ban on using the Pinkerton detectives in issues of labor disputes, immigration restriction, and women's suffrage. Now, I want to point you to this graduated income tax because that is the system that is in place today. But at this particular time, there was just a basic income tax that people needed to pay. And of course, there were luxury taxes. And so what this Populist Party is advocating for is that the amount of taxes that a person pays should be uh, related to the amount of income that they earn. In other words, if you make $1,000 a year, you should pay less than someone who makes $100,000 a year. Again, this is 1892, and they are still advocating for the 8-hour workday. And the Populist Party is also advocating for women's suffrage. Remember, women do not have the right to vote yet. Now, the Populist Party focused on a lot of economic conditions. It appealed to African Americans, but it did not explicitly address issues of racial equality in their platform. In 1892, Populists nominated James B. Weaver for president. He was a former Union Civil War general. Weaver came in third, not surprising, but he did win more than 1 million popular votes and also won 22 electoral votes, so that is extremely significant. This was a huge accomplishment for a third-party candidate. Populists were successful at the state level in 1892 and managed to elect 10 representatives to Congress, 5 U.S. senators, 3 governors, and 1,500 state legislators. Their success continued in the next election in 1892, and they tallied 42% more votes. The greatest surge in these votes came from the South. The results positioned the Populists for a fight in the next presidential election, which would be held in 1896. Now, people are very frustrated with the way that they feel like they are being treated by not just the business owners, but by the government. And so they do begin to organize and try to find ways to combat these unfair practices. Now, again, the Populists do enjoy in 1892 a significant victory, even though they lose the general election, and they also see a lot of involvement in people joining the Populist Party from the South in 1894. Now, during this particular time, we have several economic events that take place that really trigger just an economic depression. The nation's unemployment rate is actually at 12%. Now, that number is relatively high, certainly higher than it is today, lower than it will be at the time of the Great Depression, but a very high unemployment rate on the heels of this Gilded Age where even though working conditions are pretty bad, most people have the opportunity to work. President Grover Cleveland was very ineffective at this particular time. Cleveland really didn't know what to do. There wasn't much that he could do at that particular time. So in response to this, Jacob Coxey and Carl Brown lead a march on Washington, D.C. in 1894. And they really try to push the government to provide a safety net for all of these people, millions of workers who are facing unemployment. And they're saying that there needs to be something in place to help people in the event that they are suddenly unemployed to no fault of their own. Now, Coxey believed that the government had the power to handle the situation and that they should. And they really looked to the Cleveland administration to do something. Roughly 500 unemployed people came to the march, so not a huge number. But it did attract thousands of spectators, people who came to watch this event. The police, of course, came and broke up the demonstration by what they called Coxey's Army, this 500 unemployed people who are marching on DC. They arrested Coxey for trespassing. President Cleveland refused to acknowledge that their situation really merited any kind of federal response. This was not a time in our nation's history when the federal government felt that it had a responsibility or a duty or even the ability to step in these situations where people needed help. Cleveland's response to these different issues had continued to develop frustration and apathy on the part of the people. Cleveland's response during the Pullman strike, which we've already discussed, was very much on the side of the business leaders and not the worker. Cleveland did not promote government assistance for any struggling Americans, black or white, and he frustrated the Western miners when he pushed Congress to repeal the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. As a result, this destabilized U.S. currency. Remember, with the Silver Act, there is a guarantee that when you buy a good, if you're buying it with silver, that there's a certain value associated with that silver. In the event that we're using paper money, the value of that paper money is really only connected to the value that we collectively agree that it has. So a $100 bill will buy you $100 worth of items, right? But that $100 bill will lose value or gain value depending on what it is backed up with. Cleveland and J.P. Morgan crafted a plan to sell government bonds to keep the federal government financially solvent. This appeared to many to be a very corrupt scheme in which the rich would get richer and the poor, of course, would continue to be poor. Congress attempted to keep the prices of imports high by raising taxes on goods through the 1894 Wilson-Gorman Act, but the tariff inadvertently denied foreigners a means to buy American exports. So even though it was intended to keep Americans from buying foreign products, it made it difficult for foreigners to buy American products. The tariff also included a very progressive income tax of 2% on all earnings over $4,000. But in 1895, in the Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust case, the Supreme Court ruled that income tax was unconstitutional and denounced it as another salvo in the war of the poor against the rich. So the Supreme Court is also siding with the wealthiest people. In 1894, the congressional elections were held, and the Democrats lost 120 seats in the House. This was a significant beginning of voter disenchantment with the Democratic Party. This led to significant electoral changes in the next 1896 election. People began to move, people began to relocate. In 1896, Democrat William Jennings Bryan and Republican William McKinley ran against one another and fundamentally altered American politics for decades. Now, William Jennings Bryan actually enjoyed the endorsement of the Populists, that third party that was made up of members that were workers in iron and farming industries, as well as laborers in various industries. Now, Bryan was an advocate for farmers, but he also supported silver coinage. This was significant. The first major party nominee from the party since 1868 that was not from New York, from Indiana, or from Ohio. So he's coming in to this election kind of as a political outsider. He campaigned by traveling across the country to win support. Ohio Governor William McKinley supported high tariffs and a gold standard, and unlike the barnstorming Bryan, McKinley remained at home while his campaign manager, named Mark Hanna, raised funds from the wealthy industrialist, disseminated campaign literature, and hired speakers to travel throughout the country to counter Bryan's campaign. Fundraising had a significant impact on the outcome of the campaign. Bryan himself raised about $1 million in campaign funds, but McKinley raised $16 million. McKinley also won 51% of the popular vote, so not a sweeping victory in terms of popular vote, but he did win 61% of the electoral vote. The outcome of the election reflected the shift in voting patterns, and Republicans created a coalition among industrial owners and workers. The workers, of course, blamed the Democratic Party for the collapse of the economy in 1893. Bryan represented rural and Southern interests, which did not present a broad or strong enough coalition for victory. Now, here is a cartoon. It's in your book, so we won't spend any time on it. But I would encourage you, goodness gracious, I would encourage you to think about what this means in terms of the country. What we're seeing here is that the laborer is really saddled with a lot of debt, right? They've got the heavy debts, plus they have the interest of those debts. Now here we can see the election of 1896. Now you're going to have to think back just a little bit to those earlier elections in which the country has kind of been reunited after the Civil War. These states here, Democrat states, which had been part of the Confederacy. These states up here in the north, which had been Republican states, got a couple of border states here, which had tried to stay out of the Civil War. But again, the majority of individual states, right, are actually supporting William Jennings Bryan. But McKinley here is able to get more of the electoral vote because he's getting these states that have large populations of people, which means they have large electors. Is very, very significant. These areas here, these southern areas, and certainly this western area is very rural. People are very spread out. As a result of the McKinley election, we begin to see the decline of the Populist Party. It becomes very difficult for populists to stay united because the people who are members of the Populist Party have such diverse interests and they're not really able to come together and combat these large business owners. Within the Populist Party, we begin to see that issues of race also will continue to bubble to the surface. The Populists were never able to bridge the gap between the farmers and the industrial workers. They really shared no interests other than the fact that they were competing against the wealthiest. Southerners, threatened by the populist movement, began to address issues of voter access and begin to deny poor whites and blacks access to the ballot. Now, if you remember, we've already begun to implement these various poll taxes and literacy tests to make it very difficult for African Americans to vote. And then we implemented, the Supreme Court upheld this kind of grandfather clause, which was that if a person's grandfather was able to vote, they could vote. Now what we see is in the South, these poor white voters are actually voting for the populist-minded people. And so the Southerners will need to find a way to address this and restrict their access. And so they begin to use those literacy tests and use those poll taxes to also restrict the rights and the access of poor white people from the ballot. Now, in 1898, in a Supreme Court case called Williams v. Mississippi, the court upheld the legality of the educational and economic measures to determine franchise or access to the ballot. And this actually influenced the Populist Party to embrace white supremacy as a way to maintain their existence. Tom Watson of Georgia distanced himself from the earlier calls for racial unity in order to keep poor whites in the Populist Party. So the Populist Party, which initially did recognize that all people had a common interest, began to embrace white supremacy. Watson reasoned that poor whites have the courage to vote against the rich whites, but recognize that they are separate from their black neighbors. Populism really provides an example of a political movement that failed, but nonetheless did have important influence. Many of the populist reforms, such as the direct election of senators, the graduated income tax, government regulation of business and banking, and the sub-treasury system were adopted later on in the 20th century. In their efforts to increase alliances between the farmers and the workers, populists called attention to the influence that the working class could have if they could be united. Populists also made it clear that farmers could no longer embrace individualism, but they needed to be united with other workers if they wanted to be able to collectively bargain and seek to make their voice heard in the federal government.